So good afternoon, everybody. And on behalf of all of the event partners, Erickson, Gsma, Huawei, Nokia, and ZTE, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, focusing on licensed 6 gigahertz for 5G, an opportunity for society in Europe. The organisers have asked me just to say a couple of words at the start to talk a little bit about the platform that we're using for the event today. I'm sure many of you have been on the platform before and are familiar with the platform that we have. There is one difference that we are using today. So instead of the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a Q&A function instead. So there's a slight difference in that we're just asking for questions rather than the discussion points from you all in the audience. We want your questions for our speakers. So please do put any questions that you have into the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And we will be passing those over to the moderator for the session, to Jeanette, towards the end of the session, and we'll be looking to answer as many of your questions as you can. So please do pass those questions across. We do have about 45 minutes, or 35 minutes, I should say, for questions at the end of the session. So we'll be looking to bring as many of those in as we can. Really looking forward to today's event. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage and pass over to our moderator for this afternoon. That's Jeanette Stewart from Analysys Mason. Jeanette, welcome. Great to have you with us. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers here. So really looking forward to it. So I will pass over to you and leave it in your capable hands.
Thanks, Dan, and good day to everybody. I would like to welcome everybody to this event. As Dan has indicated, the event is titled Licensed 6 gigahertz for 5G, an opportunity for society in Europe. My name is Jeanette Stewart, and I work in the Spectrum Consulting team at Analysys Mason. Some of you may be familiar with us. We are independent telecoms, media and technology consultants and research providers. The event organisers today have asked me to moderate this event this afternoon. The topic of the event is the 6 gigahertz band, as you will be aware, and the demands in the 6 gigahertz band, specifically in Europe. We will be hearing from representatives from the mobile industry on their views concerning evolution of 5G and additional mid-band spectrum needs for 5G or IMT. And we will also be hearing from several regulators in the European region in relation to preparations for addressing this agenda item for the World Radio Communications Conference in 2023, which is agenda item 1.2. The specific topic this afternoon is the upper part of the 6 gigahertz band from 6425 to 7125 megahertz. However, we might discuss the entire 6 gigahertz band in the context of the discussions, I think, this afternoon. Currently, the incumbent uses of the spectrum include fixed links, fixed satellite and mobile services. Allocations are used in different markets to different degrees of intensity. There are both Earth to space links and space to Earth non-GSO satellite feeder links, and there are fixed links as well. So when we come on to discussing some of the coexistence issues, those are the sorts of issues to bear in mind. The audience may be aware that in the lower 6 gigahertz, European regulators have already determined that new bands will be provisioned for unlicensed use. Outside of Europe, several regulators internationally have determined that the full 6 gigahertz band, including the part 6425 to 7125, will be available on an unlicensed basis. So the preparations for WRC 23 are particularly interesting in Europe, given the issues at play. I'm going to hand now over to Luciana Camargos, who is head of Spectrum in the GSMA, and Luciana is going to introduce the topic before we move on to the industry presentation. So Luciana, nice to see you, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk at this event and see so many familiar faces on the panel side earlier before we started this. So it is a pleasure. So why are we here today? We're here today because the mobile industry and the GSMA particularly worries and cares very much about mid-band spectrum. We believe that mid-band spectrum has a very important role to play. We believe that operators will need low-band spectrum, mid-band spectrum, and high-band spectrum to be able to provide all the services that we know they can provide. And we have been talking about that for a long time. But this conference seems to be more focused on mid-band. I will focus my speech today on mid-band part of the conference anyway. So moving on to the next slide, please. I wanted to touch a bit about coverage because it's not something that is linked to mid-band naturally. We tend to go to UHF band, but there is a very important point that we would like to make about coverage and cost. One of the things we want you to take from today is the role WRC23 can play in reducing the cost and increasing coverage. These are crucial goals. Before WRC19, in the last year, this year, we have discussed the benefits that 5G can bring in terms of education, employment, health, and other issues. With these benefits comes a risk that people without access to these services become increasingly marginalized. This means that all of us have a responsibility to ensure that indeed 5G is for all. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are here today. City-wide and rural spectrum is being discussed at WRC23, and these present an opportunity to expand digital inclusion. Highlighting in this slide, we see a GSMA coverage campaign that shows all the challenges we face. So almost 10% of the world's population does not have access to mobile internet. So we see that 4 billion people are connected, but there are 3.3 billion people that, due to barriers such as cost or digital literacy, live within mobile broadband coverage but remain unconnected. And I think that's one of the main challenges we have, is to address that. We used to think that access to coverage was, or to services was all that was needed, but now we see that it involves a lot more, and we all have a role to play in that. Next slide, please. And again, at WRC23, we're really hoping that WRC23 can provide solutions for these familiar challenges, the challenges that we have been discussing. Those of us who have been discussing WRCs for a long time, we'll see that we are here again discussing similar things. Harmonization. We have an opportunity to harmonize additional bands. We have an opportunity to harmonize 3.5, further harmonize 3.5. We have an opportunity to harmonize 6 gigahertz. There is an increase in 4.8 gigahertz. So harmonization is key, but also cost efficiency. If you have sufficient channel bandwidth, you'll be able to provide the service in a lot more cost-efficient way. And as we know from the coverage data presented before, that is very, very, very relevant and important to the scenario. So next slide, please. So what have we done at the GSMA? At the GSMA, the first question we got asked in this cycle, early 2020, is how much spectrum is needed in mid-bands? We did studies in the ITU ahead of WRC15, but that was different. It was a 4G environment. Discussions were different back then. Those of you who remember, the results came in between 1340 to 1960 megahertz, so 1,340 to 1,960, depending on the country, depending on the situation. We never really got that level of identification in the ITU, but that was the demand that was identified at the time for both low band and mid band. We were discussing below 6 gigahertz at the time. Well, no one has done studies since, and we thought we need to do that. We need to find out in a 5G era, in talking about IMT 2020, what is relevant, what is needed. So looking into ITUR recommendations and the vision of IMT 2020, we look to identify, we worked with that on Coleago, obviously, we look to identify what are the most relevant points and capabilities of IMT 2020 that would be most related to mid-band spectrum. And the parameters that we chose were user experience data rate of 100 megabits per second on the downlink and 50 megabits per second on the uplink, which is an increase tenfold from what 4G was, and also the area traffic capacity. So that is what megabits per second per square meter, and that is 100 fold increase compared to the previous technology. And that's what we've studied. So if you show into the next slide, please. what we have found, and here I'm showing the results for Europe, but if you go to our report, which is on the screen, you show results. It is a global study. I think it was 38 cities analyzed. A couple have been done since. But if you look at the results for Europe, we have the lower end of the estimates, we have the upper end of the estimates, because there is, of course, there are other elements as well. The study takes into account the activity factor, how many users are actually using that sort of level of service at a given time, how much of that is offloaded into millimeter wave. So there's some variables there. But it shows that what we found is that on average, 2 gigahertz of spectrum is needed in the mid-bands. Let's call mid-bands between 1 and 7 gigahertz. That's 2 gigahertz on average. And what is interesting is that when we looked into the different countries we studied, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, or higher-income countries, as defined by the United Nations, they all came very closely to 2 gigahertz average, because at the end of the day, it's a population density study. It's a population density driven study, how many people are using the service at the same time and how many people would like to use the service. And that came up as on average 2 gigahertz. So if you go to the next slide, please. Looking into the existing spectrum in region 1, and there we have Europe, we have MENA, we have Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a bit of a change on these slides, and I apologize. My red square moved a bit. But in Europe, if you release all the spectrum that has been earmarked and all the spectrum that is listed on the screen above, and all the spectrum and all of that is migrated into 5G, that's what we consider. We migrate everything into 5G. And if you migrate everything into 5G, you need 2 gigahertz of spectrum on average. So Europe has 1,050 that can be released and can be harmonized for IMT in between 1 and 7 gigahertz. So we see there's it's lacking 950 megahertz. So where are we going to find these 950 megahertz? And that's where WRC23 comes handy. Next slide, please. The WRC23 agenda item. So for region 1, I will leave UHF aside. We don't want to talk about UHF here today. Happy to talk about that another time. But if you look at 3334, we're talking about that further for region 1. I have a feeling that is quite hard for Europe. 3638, already done many years ago, not relevant for Europe. 48499 could be an option, but from what I've seen on the discussions, not really an option. And then we have 6425 to 7125, and that's where we have left. There is really no other spectrum being discussed, or no other spectrum that could be made available for IMT, and that's why we keep going back to the 6 gigahertz band. So next slide, please. I'll go through that very quickly. We see that a number of decisions for unlicensed in the band. We see some decisions for license in the band. We see that Europe has decided on the lower part, but not on the upper part. And again, if we don't count on the upper 6 gigahertz, where would the rest of the spectrum come from? But if we go to the next slide, we'll see that 6 gigahertz band, and there's a lot of information there, is a strong match for 5G. First of all, it's globally allocated to the mobile service on a primary basis. It is a good balance between coverage and capacity. It can support large contiguous blocks. So it can give economy of scale, which we like so much. And it has wide industry support. We did a research with our operators. 90% said, oh yeah, that's very important to us. That's what we would like to see in the future. So we see the studies are ongoing in the ITU. I don't think we can make any judgments at this stage of where we're going. We just got the parameters. The studies have started in the previous cycle. I happen to chair that group, so I can have that conversation if people would like to. But let's wait until we finish the results of this, finish these studies to make any assumptions or any conclusions about that. So if you go to the next slide, I think that's how I would like to finish. Where will your mid-band spectrum needs going to come from? So if I'm a regulator, if I'm a government, where am I going to look? If everything that I have for IMT has already been licensed or in the pipeline for being licensed, and it's migrating to 5G and it's evolving to 5G, and I allow technology neutrality, I allow my operators to evolve to 5G, where else am I going to look? And we particularly find that answer hard to answer, with that question hard to answer without looking at 6 gigahertz, but we invite you during this panel today to think about that question. And for you, those who are watching the panel, to think about that question back home. So where will your mid-band spectrum needs going to come from? With that, I will conclude, and good luck in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciana. I hope we will hear from you later during the Q&A session. For the audience, if you have questions for Luciana or indeed for any of the panelists, if you put your question into the platform, then the event organisers will pass those through to us. So thank you again, Luciana. I'm now going to introduce the first session, which is the industry view. We have a series of presentations. I would like to introduce, first of all, Peter Cosamini, who's a strategy manager in Vodafone, and he will give Vodafone's view on this topic. So Peter, hello, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Jeanette. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Just the first slide then, please. So firstly, I think it's important when we're discussing spectrum needs to actually see a little bit about what Vodafone do. So Vodafone is a provider of connectivity. We operate both mobile and fixed networks in 21 markets within Europe, outside of Europe. We have the largest fixed broadband footprint in Europe. We connect not only consumers but enterprises to over 400 million devices, not just smartphones and fixed broadband routers, but also cars, machines, sensors, range of IoT devices, and even wireless broadband routers. So this is important to highlight because in the context of spectrum needs, we and other converged operators are in the best and unique position to specify what consumers and society needs. We don't build products, we don't build radio technologies, we use them to deliver services to customers. And we feel that is really important to highlight in the context of spectrum needs. Next page, please. So if you look at our fixed and mobile networks, we see the same profile. Data is ramping up, data is accelerating, approximately double every 2 years. And it's the same profile across fixed and mobile. And that's driven by consumer and business demands, which you can see there. Specifically on mobile, we obviously see video consumption, not only in terms of more video, but also the higher bitrate resolution video. With 5G, the higher speeds, higher download, higher speed networks, we see cloud-based services will become more and more popular, and cloud gaming is one example of that, which we've already launched in some of our markets. The capabilities of the low latency capabilities of 5G also allow new low latency mobile edge computing services, such as AR and VR on the go for navigation, field services, maintenance, also e-commerce solutions. There's a range of use cases that that we can enable there, and then there's a range of other consumer and business IoT use cases around health, logistics, energy consumption, reduced emissions, and smart cities. So we see clear drivers across consumer and business. Combined with the new 5G capabilities that we're deploying today, we see clear drivers for that mobile traffic demand to increase over time. In addition to that, we now offer in most of our markets, as do other operators, fixed wireless access services. So this is to complement our fixed broadband solutions and provide wireless broadband services where fixed broadband services may not be economically viable, or customers prefer the simplicity of a nomadic, simple plug-and-play solution. In fact, we see some ministries already announcing subsidies to solve the digital divide in certain parts of countries, to offer economically viable fixed broadband solutions or broadband solutions. It was interesting to note the traffic profiles on our networks before and after the pandemic. And specifically on the mobile side, it was interesting to note that even when our consumers still had the option of a Wi-Fi network away from their business premise, specifically at home, they still chose to prefer to send data over their mobile networks, and that's driven by mobile networks, speed and performance, and also the availability of tariffs these days, unlimited tariffs, so worry-free tariffing. So the key point here is it's all about customer choice. It's allowing customers to be connected in the best possible way wherever they are, and that's really important again when considering spectrum needs. Next page, please. So with respect to 6 gigahertz, the key messages are our digital economy and digital society basically needs both good wide area mobile broadband connectivity and good local license exempt Wi-Fi connectivity. And to achieve the best outcome for society and enterprises and consumers in general, we need a fair and balanced approach to 6 gigahertz spectrum allocation, allowing it to be safeguarded both for mobile and local license exempt / Wi-Fi networks. If you look at where we're deploying 5G today and we extrapolate our traffic growth, then we see that we will begin to hit capacity limitations or using existing 5G spectrum in around 6 years. And therefore, that will begin to impact our ability to deliver all the use cases and services that we previously described. We think 6 gigahertz spectrum can work for wide area mobile services with massive MIMO technology, antenna technology, which is already an established part of 5G and is evolving in terms of size of products, power consumption of products, cost of products. And we aim to achieve a similar level of coverage as we do with 3.5 gigahertz today. So 6 gigahertz in terms of public wide area mobile networks gives us a cost-efficient evolution path for our 5G networks. The alternatives are economically unfeasible and practically not viable. So it's really important. 6 gigahertz is really important for keeping down the cost per gigabyte, which means that we can translate those benefits into the end customers when we're delivering an expansion and diversification of the services they enjoy today. We think 6 gigahertz is the only available, feasible opportunity. There are no other spectrum opportunities, viable spectrum opportunities. So by not allocating the upper band for mobile services, it will have a significant impact on being able to scale 5G networks with significant outcomes, negative outcomes on digital society and economy in general. So this in a nutshell is our key messages. Again, I stress that as mobile network operator and other converged mobile network operators or fixed and mobile services, we're in a credible position to specify what our future spectrum needs should be for not only our business but society and the digital economy in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that presentation. Just to remind the audience, if you have any questions for Peter, please put those into the platform and we will discuss any questions when we come on to the industry and regulatory Q&A at the end of the session today. So thanks again, Peter. I would now like to move on to Stefan Epetry, who is Deputy Director for Strategy and International in Orange. So Stefan, over to you. Hello.
Hello, Janet. Hello, everybody. My name is Stefan Epetry, and I'm part of the Spectrum Strategy team within Orange Group. We are also a convergent operator in 30 countries in both Europe and Africa. So we're a Region 1 operator, and you can understand why 6 Gsma and also the other agenda item concerning the 3.5 Gsma band are very important for us. You saw from Peter and Luciana how important the 6 Gsma band is from the perspective of coverage, cost efficiency, and traffic. I will try to put it from the perspective of use cases. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as you are all aware, 5G has become a reality in the past few years, couple of years. We Orange started the 5G deployment back in the autumn of 2019, thanks to the availability in Europe of the 3.5 Gigahertz band, and also with the low frequency bands for the uplink component. And unsurprisingly, as it was the case with the previous generations, everything started with the consumer market and B2B mobile broadband, we saw that as the technology was more and more popular and was being adopted by general public, we saw the development of several use cases that can be that are available with the current version of this technology. And during the pandemic, we saw with the application as telemedicine, video surveillance. Also, as per date, the technology is suitable for vehicle-to-vehicle communication. We saw a lot of progress in the 5G Croco program, the European program. And moving on towards the future, we, as all the other operators, will implement the new features that are available in recent 3GPP releases like 16 and 17. And I'm talking here about standalone architecture, slicing, ultra reliable, low latency standards, if you like. With this development, we see the potential of new use cases and new application coming up, starting from, let's say, 2023 to 2025. I'm talking here about smart city grids, new application in telemedicine, maybe drone asset management. And beyond that, we saw that 5G will play a role in automation, in industry application, and AGV management, and so on. All these use cases, all these applications have a common denominator: mid frequency ranges, and this is where the 6 Ghz band comes in place. Because sooner or later we are afraid that we will hit the ceiling in terms of capacity with the existing band, with 3.5, 3.4, 3.8. We don't see any prospects of other mid frequency band appear in Europe, as we saw what are the latest development with the 3.8, 4.2 GHz band. So we believe that the 6 GHz band is the key enabler for most of these applications and in use cases. Next slide, please. My second subject is one that it goes about the coexistence, and specifically the coexistence between the AMT and fixed services. It is a issue that is being partially treated in Working Party 5D in WRC process, because it is a national issue, and also it is a issue for us because we as operator, we are the main consumers of fixed links in Europe for backhauling, and we are preoccupied of on one hand being a prospective client in the future, and on one hand being an incumbent. But we believe that coexistence, it is possible between these two services. And on one side, it is a problem that is being resolved by itself, because with the introduction of 5G and higher capacity, we will also require larger pipes in terms of backhauling, and the 6 GHz band is not really suitable for high capacity. In fact, it's a quite low capacity bands in terms of backhauling. This is why there's a natural tendency to deploy backhauling, at least for us, in higher bands like the E bands, for example, which are much larger in terms of capacity. And on the other hand, as you all know, the 6 GHz for fixed services, it's suitable for long distances, long hops, like let's say around 40 kilometers. And this is not necessarily compatible with urban deployment. So there is a natural distinction, a natural split between these two technology when it comes to using the 6 GHz band. And as a consequence, we saw that there is, at least in the early stages, as a transitory measure, the 6 GHz band could be used for urban deployment of 5G, while the fixed links could continue to operate for, as I said, for a transitory period in the rural environment. There are cases where, for example, fixed links can be deployed in urban area, and these are extreme. There are not too many cases like that. So we believe that solution can be met on case by case situations. If we are optimistic and believe that the 6 GHz band will be available for mobile broadband, if we consider for operator typical market, we will be looking at bandwidth in excess of 150 megahertz for each operator. So in the cases of in the specific cases, we could adapt this bandwidth to avoid co-channel interference with fixed links that are deployed in an urban area, considering that the bandwidth of fixed links channels are largely of 28 megahertz. So we can reduce our 5G bandwidth by 28 megahertz in some cases. So in a nutshell, we believe that coexistence, at least with fixed services, it is possible. That is in a nutshell my presentation, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So we will now move on to our next industry statement. So moving on from the operators who are deploying the technology onto companies who are building the technology. So first of all, we will hear from Erica Tejador, who's Director of Government and Industry Relations in Erickson. So Erica, over to you.
Now, I think it's Jan speaking first as the third of the operators, and then we'll move on to Erica. So,
thank you, Dan. Yes. Sorry about that. Yes. So just looking at my notes here. So we have the third industry presentation from the operator side, Jan Hendrik Jochum, who's Vice President of Spectrum Policy and Projects at Deutsche Telekom. Jan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Janet, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So we have heard already a lot on the 6 gigahertz issue already, but let's take a step back and take a broader view. Next slide, please. If you look at the situation of the telco industry at the moment, you can see on the left-hand side that there's a huge gap between the development in the last 10 years in the US and in Europe. So what you see is that the US, in terms of market capitalization, that the US telco industry has a very good path and made an uptake of more than 200%. At the same time, Europe is declining and declining, and we are losing in our industry a lot of capitalization, and we are really under pressure. What you see on these figures here. So this has reasons. The one thing is regulation that is much more investment friendly in the US. There's no access and no price regulation for mobile in the US, and for example, but also much more spectrum is made available, faster, more innovative. And the other thing is fragmentation. In the US, you have a big market, 3 operators, more than 300 people, while in the US, while in Europe, we are in a situation with a very many MNOs for some more people. So, but still, the markets are still quite fragmented. So, what you can see from that one, the European industry here is really under pressure, and what is needed is a strengthening of the European operators, and especially as we have a huge 5G investment challenge in Europe. What you see on the other side, we have ambitious political targets. We want to cover all areas with 5G. We want to do that with 100 megabit per second for any customer. But at the same time, we are under pressure on the market. We have declining revenues in the EU, and this is resulting into a huge gap in terms of investment. And also, following that, if we look forward, we expect also to have a lower adoption of 5G in Europe for the next years compared to North America, also to Asia. Starting with that, the question is, what has this to do with 6 gigahertz? So next slide, please. I think a lot. So next slide, please. 6 gigahertz, from my perspective, is about enabling digitization in Europe, and by enabling cost-efficient deployment. It's about competitiveness of the European industry compared to other regions. It's about strengthening the European industry. So what we have seen is the customer data is expected to greatly increase in the next years. Still, just saw today Erickson's mobile report, is still a CAGR of more than 20% per year of traffic in the mobile networks expected. And to fulfill this demands, this customer demands, to keep up with this development, is that we need additional mid-band spectrum for 5G. This was shown by a study by Coleago. I think it was mentioned by Luciana before. And the situation, what we see at the moment, is even more complicated, because not all harmonized band for mobile, what we have in the mid-band, is available in all markets. Examples are 1500 are 2.3 gigahertz. It's also some parts of reservations for verticals, what we see, what create additional scarcity. So not even the resources that are meant for IMT are available for the industry. So the need for spectrum is even higher. And we need spectrum for balanced coverage and capacity assigned with affordable fields, and this is important for the economically network investments in Europe. So, and this is more the demand side, and on the other side, from a technical point of view, looking at the 6 gigahertz band, this is the only really realistic option as mid-band resource to meet the demands we have seen here. But also to provide a wider area coverage still, because like due to the technical propagation, you still can deploy 6 gigahertz in a comparable range like the 3.6 gigahertz band. So next slide, please. And looking at that, this mid-band spectrum we need it for wide area networks, and we need to take a look about what we are talking about. We are talking about 5G wide area networks that we need to fulfill the demand of the people. And if you look at the right-hand side, you see a discrepancy at the moment between spectrum for wide area and nationwide use, what you can deploy on macro networks, and spectrum for local area usage. At the moment, there's a gap of about 1.6 times more spectrum for local area networks that could be addressed by 6 gigahertz. So the wide area networks need to catch up with that. We need a good balance. As Peter said in the beginning, we need both. We need wide area networks, we need local area networks, but we need them on the same level. And that means we need more spectrum. The upper 6 gigahertz, as you can see on the right-hand side, might be an option to catch up, keeping in mind that the situation for wide area networks is even worse in some countries, as 2.3 is not available in every country. And also the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum in Europe is partly reserved for verticals, was also not available, but goes over to the other side, to the local side. So it's really important that we don't get into a situation where this imbalance grows up to 2.4 factor after WRC. If you would not allocate the 6 gigahertz band to licensed use, but more to airline or local licensing. So only with allocation of the 6 gigahertz band for IMTs this can be prevented. And taking also into account the low and medium power networks, capture less users, less traffic per cell. They do not allow for the nomadic usage, what we all expect from 5G, to be connected everywhere, anytime, handovers and on the move, and they therefore do not contribute to the EC's digital decay targets. Next slide, please. So thinking about that, what would be the implications of not allocating the 6 gigahertz for IMT? So one implication would be that the European digitization would further fall beyond other regions, in particular the US and China, as the resources will just not be there to deploy economically very high capacity networks. It would further weaken the European telco industry and the capability to deliver these networks, because only with this resource we will be able in an economic viable way to build up the capacity that is needed, what we have seen, for example, in the beginning from Luciana. Exactly from the point that not allocating 6 gigahertz for IMT, you would give the spectrum also to the OTTs that are the main propagator of other unlicensed use, which are not paying the networks. So we are, as an industry, are expected to build this very high capacity networks, and without having the resources and giving to these people that are using the networks but not paying to it, we will not reach the targets. So the outdoor deployment of 5G in Europe would really suffer capacity and thus quality of service. And with additionally spectrum scarcity, what would occur from mid of this decade already, we will drive up spectrum prices further, what will further weaken the European industry and therefore further slow down the deployment. So only as a consequence, mobile operators will not be able to provide the required 5G outdoor capacity in an economic viable manner if we will not allocate 6 gigahertz for IMT. Thank you very much. And back to Janet.
Thank you very much, Jan. So we are now moving on to Erica Tejador, who is Director of Government and Industry Relations at Erickson. So Erica, over to you.
Thank you, Janet, and good day, everyone. I'm really excited of being in this great session today and great panelists that we have here lined up. Today, I will be representing not only Erickson, but also all the other IMT vendors, Huawei, Nokia, and ZTE. Next, please. First, I would like to take a step back on what Europe has been doing in the last years. We have done quite some effort on working on harmonization on a spectrum in different fronts at a European level. And Europe has created back before 2019 a roadmap for initial launch of 5G, and that included the mid-bands 3438 gigahertz. Europe has also created a path for local connectivity, and now CEPT is working on 3842 for local area connectivity. At the same time, also Europe has secured the development and expansion of radio LAN by allocating the lower part of the 6 gigahertz. And this is also assuming that we will be working in Europe to cover for the needs for an improvement of the home broadband to be able to benefit as citizens from the developments of Wi-Fi. And as a natural next step, now Europe should create a roadmap for licensed mid-band spectrum. And this is to ensure the evolution of 5G. Next slide, please. Looking at the RSPG interim opinion on WRC 23, it's well reflected that the 6 gigahertz has similar characteristics as the 3.5 gigahertz. And this is indeed a statement that we can confirm with both our simulations that you can see on the left side, and also with field test results that you can see on the right side. In all these figures, which I will not go into all details, but in both cases, in the simulations and in the test results, you can see that the spectral efficiency is similar for 6 gigahertz and 3.5 gigahertz. So that means that we can actually achieve similar performance. And we see the 6 gigahertz as a complementary band to offer capacity together with the 3.5 gigahertz in the same macro cell grid. Next slide, please. Now we have heard also about sharing with different services, and indeed sharing is a very important element when we talk about the allocation of a spectrum. And we as vendors are very active in both in the CPT discussions in terms of sharing, but also in the ITUR discussions in Working Party 5D. Now I would like to note also that if we look in particular at the case of Europe, and now we consider FSS, if we look at Europe, we know that most of the satellites over Europe are actually working by using the downlink within 3742 and the uplink pairing in the lower 6 gigahertz. However, FSS uplink is obviously an international issue, and therefore it's for ITUR to assess carefully. And that is what is being done in Working Party 5D. And as Luciana stated at the beginning, this is very early stages, but we would like to show you preliminary studies that we have done, and we have of course presented in PT1. And you can see that if we look at IMT and FSS uplink, and considering the agreed ITUR parameters, our preliminary results indicate that it's possible to share between 5G and R, and this is assuming macro cell citywide coverage and FSS uplink. Next slide, please. The other service that is very important and of high interest, and Stefan already touched upon it, that is fixed links. So when we look at sharing with fixed links, is something that we have been carefully looking at. As you know, we are not only, most of us are not only vendors of mobile equipment, we are also interested on fixed links. And Looking at the studies that we have done, we have looked at the possibilities to have sharing, co-channel sharing between IMT and fixed links. And our conclusion is, as Stefan said, it needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But if you look at the results, you can see that it's possible actually to share if we take into consideration deployment consideration and or separation distances. So you can see that as long as you get away from the main lobe of fixed links, then the separation distance reduces in a large amount. Next slide, please. So here it is our summary of 6 gigahertz. So as you have seen in the simulations, the 6 gigahertz offers complementary capacity to 3.5 gigahertz based on the same macro cellular grid. We believe that a balance in Europe between low medium power deployments and higher power deployments can be achieved in Europe. And as Jan included in his presentation, right now we have an imbalance. But if Europe allocates the upper part of the 6 gigahertz for licensing 5G, then this gap can be closed and there will be a balance in Europe. When looking at sharing with incumbents, both with FSS uplink and FS, our preliminary assessment indicates that it is feasible. However, there is more that needs to be done in PT1 and working party 5D. Now looking also at the ecosystem, which is key for not only for Europe but for the whole world. We know that there are field tests and trials, and they are progressing, and the ecosystem is in fact building up. And the ecosystem will match the availability of a spectrum, and we can assure that that will happen. Something that will help for the ecosystem to grow faster and also to facilitate economies of scale is to ensure consistent decisions by national administrations. And of course, here WRC 23 plays a key role because it will ensure harmonization of the spectrum and with that economies of scale. And the license 5G in the upper 6 gigahertz will provide reliable, high capacity, low latency, wide area, as it was mentioned by the operators, cost-effective connectivity. And this is a pillar to achieve all the goals from Europe, and it's a pillar for the European digital decade. And with that, I thank you all for your attention. Looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Erica. And our final presenter in this session is Tim Frost, wireless technology and standardization expert in MediaTek. So Tim, welcome, and over to you for your presentation.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Tim Frost. I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to, one second. Yeah, so I'm going to basically present a view of why we think a balanced approach for 6 gigahertz in Europe is the best way forward. So next slide, please. So yeah, so a bit about the device ecosystem for licensed and unlicensed connectivity. So MediaTek is a leading wireless chipset supplier globally for serving different connectivity needs. And we do that via technologies such as 5G, NR, LTE, NB-IoT, and Wi-Fi. And we integrate it into a range of different devices, which you can see on the right here. So smartphones, feature phones, tablets, all the way to televisions. And we're basically currently supplying commercial chipsets for 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi as well. So I guess one question is, what's the feasibility of having licensed and unlicensed 6 gigahertz operating in the same device? So there's different frequency bands or multiple frequency bands already implemented into devices today. And some of those frequency bands and many of those frequency bands actually have different requirements in different regions. And also obviously there's different regional specific frequency bands. So we think that it should be feasible to extend that approach to 6 gigahertz and support licensed and unlicensed within the same device. And generally moving forward, we aim to continue providing technology and products supporting operation in licensed and unlicensed spectrum to address the increasing global demand for wireless connectivity that all the operators have mentioned as well. So next slide, please. So what's our view on licensed 6 gigahertz operation in Europe specifically? So we see that licensed spectrum in the upper 6 gigahertz is an attractive proposition as a natural extension to the sub 6 gigahertz cellular frequency bands for 5G. And of course, the benefit of licensed spectrum in general is that it can offer some guaranteed spectrum availability for the license holder. And that can improve key KPIs, which rely on performance consistency rather than just peak data rates, for example, in terms of reliable throughputs and latency and general availability as well. And we believe it's specifically or especially important for outdoor deployments to have some licensed spectrum availability for this and to build that licensed spectrum on top of what we already have. In terms of what that leads to, so as a consequence of that, we think that this will drive broader availability and applicability for some of the key kind of 5G services, such as augmented reality, intelligent transport, and smart cities. And if we can increase the kind of consistency of throughput and lower the latency at a consistent level as well, then we can really drive those and expand those use cases even further. And we generally believe that allocations of both licensed and unlicensed spectrum in 6 gigahertz will provide value and choice for consumers and businesses in Europe. And we think they're mutually complementary and give different benefits. So that gives the real choice to consumers and businesses. And just a final remark. So, I mean, in general, MediaTek supports a balanced approach to 6 gigahertz in Europe. A license allocation in the upper 6 gigahertz range, complementing the existing license exempt allocation in the lower 6 gigahertz range. So thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to all of the panelists. We're now going to have just a short break while we change over to the regulatory panel. So there will just be a 5-minute break now, and then we will convene again shortly. So please don't go far. We'll be back shortly. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So we're now about to move on to the regulatory roundtable in this event, which is on license 6 gigahertz for 5G, an opportunity for society in Europe. Just before we move on, we do have some questions for our industry panelists. Tim Frost in particular is unfortunately not able to stay for the full duration of this event. So we do have a question for Tim. So Tim, if we can bring you back, hello. And the question was, hi Tim. So the question was in relation to 3GPP specifications. Could you just say a little bit more about the status of the upper 6 gigahertz band in the specifications? Will 3GPP define a band for licensed use, and what are the timescales for doing that?
Yeah, so there was a 3GPP project approved for licensed operation in 6 gigahertz across the whole range, in the lower part and the upper part in September 2020. It was decided to leave that on hold until there's regulatory feedback, essentially. So that could come from any regions. It wasn't like a European specific allocation. It was for any usage for any region. So as soon as any regulator gets back and says, or any administration gets back and says that there's regulatory requirements available, then they will resume that work. That's the situation.
That's very clear. Thank you very much, Tim. So we will now move on. So this is the regulators roundtable, and then after we've heard from the regulators, we will then have a Q&A amongst the regulators. Each of the regulators will give a couple of minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll move on to the discussions. So first of all, could I introduce Eric Fournier, who is from the Spectrum Planning team in ANFR. So in that capacity, Eric is heavily involved in the WRC preparations in France, and he is also currently Vice Chairman of the RSPG. So Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Janet, and hello to everybody. So maybe first few information about the rollout of 5G in the mid-bands in France. 3.5 gigahertz was authorized 1 year ago, and there's already something like 5,000 sites which are authorized per operator, 5,000 per operator, which is quite a lot in 1 year, even if only half of them are active for the time being. But that's meaning when you compare to some other mid-bands where you have, for France, something like 20,000 sites which are active per operator, it means that there's a rapid, fast rollout, and that in 2 years' time frame, the 3.5 gigahertz will be used in the same way as other mid-band. So we can only recognize that this kind of frequency range is good for deployment and success of 5G, and that will be probably the same for 6G. So in the medium term, there's certainly a need for having some extra frequency band in the mid-range. Our focus for the 6 gigahertz, for the upper 6 gigahertz, is really the FSS uplink. It was mentioned, I think, by Luciana, because that's an international obligation to protect the FSS satellites, the FSS uplink. It's not something which can be decided at the national level. We will contribute from the ANFR side to ITU studies to make up our mind on that. That's really the critical one. For fixed service, it's obviously very important. Range was mentioning the use of fixed service in France, so that's not the only operator, of course, but that may reflect the reality in France. So it means that maybe in the medium term we will have a decrease of use of this frequency band by fixed service. So once again, in the medium term, enabling possibility of migrating fixed links outside this frequency band. So what is the conclusion of that? Maybe 2030 was mentioned, maybe in few years time frame after WRC 23, if we can succeed with the FSS uplink production, there would be some opportunity in the upper 6 gigahertz for 5G, or maybe for 6G, because that's corresponding also to the horizon for 6G start of deployment. Thank you.
That's very clear. Thank you very much, Eric. So our next speaker in this regulatory roundtable is from the Russian Federation, Sergei Pashtuk, who is from the NIIR, who's the regulator in Russia. So Sergei, welcome, and over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeanette, and good afternoon to all watching this webinar. So I also will bring some information regarding the situation in Russia, particular for this 6 gigahertz band issue. First of all, I admit that our regulator, and from the regulator side, we see the need for this 6 gigahertz band actually many years ago already, and the reason is that we have some difficulties in the granting spectrum in 3438 gigahertz due to the huge usage of this band by fixed satellite service. And as a result, we see that in the mid-band, we have actually a lack of spectrum. And if we wish to clear the spectrum in 3438, we need quite a long time because of the lifetime of the satellite, which is more than 15 years sometimes, and also for the financial issue that for the clear the spectrum, we need a huge amount of money. So this is one of the reasons which we many years ago already asked conference to consider this at that time lower part of the 6 gigahertz band for the IMT. And this is history, but life is going on, and we see that in Russia, this 6 gigahertz band gets some consensus among the users of this frequency band for the possibility to use upper part of the band for the licensed IMT service. And regulator from this consensus, you do some action. First of all, it was a proposal from our administration to this agenda item 1.2 regarding 6 gigahertz band to be included into the agenda of the forthcoming conference. Also, we consider that studies regarding the sharing and compatibility with incumbent services of IMT, we support this activity in ITUR and submitted already some studies with the fixed service, and we will further work to the next working party 5D meeting with additional studies with the fixed satellite service. And the third element that we are doing also is that we see the need for consideration and inclusion of this upper part of the frequencies to the 3GPP specification, and based on our initiative in RCC, currently recommendation on technical characteristic and technical condition for deployment of IMT is expected to be approved in the beginning of December. Actually, we start RCC meeting next week, and I suppose and hope that there will be agreement on this recommendation, and finally it's trigger the further work of 3GPP for inclusion of this band into the specification. And the last thing regarding the situation in Russia is that our State Radio Frequency Commission agreed to issue a decision with respect to the test in 6 gigahertz band, both for the performance possibilities as well as for the compatibility issues. And this decision, expect that within 1 year we will have a report on this issue, and this is further give us from the regulatory point of view to improve regulation for deployment of IMT in 6 gigahertz band. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. So please wait with us so that we can discuss more with you during the discussion session. So the third speaker is Alexander Kuhn, who is from the regulatory authority in Germany. So Alexander, over to you. Hello.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon from Germany. It's a pleasure to speak to you today on this 6 gigahertz issue and regarding the situation on mid-band spectrum in Germany. I think you're fully aware that we make full use of the 3.4, 3.8 gigahertz band with specifics of the MNOs and also vertical needs. We have still there some issues with remaining Earth stations of the FSS in that particular band. So, and also with the discussions now starting up to opening up the band 3.8, 4.2 for limited usage with a priority on FSS usage in that band, it still remains an issue that we need to protect the uplink of the FSS, which is corresponding to that band in 3.4 to 4.2. And that is the 6 gigahertz band. That was already the situation when we discussed the technical harmonization measures below 6.425. And the CPT took the approach that here we have only an indoor solution with very strict limitations for outdoor usage. And now we are also skeptical, as we were towards WRC 19, regarding a further studies on the elements of outdoor usage on an IMT issue. Maybe that's raising the question on the feasibility and how is sharing possible in that band. Germany is always taking the option that we would like to see with technical studies, the feasibility of compatibility issues and also their solutions. So if there is any solution in the studies indicating that we have this particular point and most likely then also usage conditions which providing a ride sharing condition between all the operators, then of course we would like to jump onto this train as well. However, up to now we have some question marks. Those studies have now not turned out to be very formal and reached a point which are very convincing at this stage. And this has already been pointed out by the industry itself too. So with that regard, we would like to support what Eric said before, that the FSS usage is rather essential there. We have also FS usage, and this is not only for the mobile operators, and that particular band it needs to be protected as well. Also, maybe some points with regarding to radio astronomy in Germany, maybe that's a national issue. However, we would like to point it out also to other nations worldwide in Region 1. And finally, therefore, I would like to raise the question here. We have a mobile allocation in the band, and maybe we have to think about the byte sharing environment in that particular regard, which may not be encompassed by an IMT identification of the band. That's it for me so far, and I'm happy to answer then later on any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And finally, I would like to introduce Umberto Maschia, who is from the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Umberto, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon to all of the participants. Just about my personal feelings, I feel like an amateur tennis player being invited to a tournament with Nadal, Federer, and Djokovic. This is just to say what I think about my colleagues of the regulator panel. Regarding the situation in Italy, a general update regarding the 5G deployment. We are currently mainly focused on the usage of the so-called pioneer bands. All of the 3 bands were awarded with auctions, and now we are in the phase of deployment. This means that I think that in the short term we will be mainly involved in reasoning about how to complete, if possible, the usage of these pioneer bands. By the way, we still have to complete to allow the use of the 700 megahertz band because of the rearrangement of the broadcast TV broadcast channel. In the 3 gigahertz band, we licensed the band 3.6 to 2.8. So reasoning has to be done about the 3.4 to 3.6, as well as for the 26 gigahertz band, where only the upper 1 gigahertz was auctioned. So we are our position at the moment is to follow as interest spectators the debate about the 6 gigahertz band, taking into account that, of course, even in Italy, the 6 gigahertz band is already used by some other services. We have a certain number of fixed links, more or less spread throughout all the territory, and a significant part of them is part of the distribution network of the broadcaster. And I would like to mention, as well as Alexander did, the radio astronomy, because we have at least 3 important sites here in Italy that use their make observation in the 6 gigahertz band. Particularly one of them is placed in the center of the Pianura Padana, so it's a place particularly open to all of the potential interference cases. So that's all for my part for this first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Umberto. So we now have around about 25 minutes, I think, for discussions amongst the regulators before we invite the industry back into the screen where we have a general Q&A. So welcome back, everybody. I wonder, we might just start by hearing a little bit more from all of you on your reactions to the industry presentations that we heard at the start of this afternoon. If I could maybe break it into sort of three key issues that we heard from the industry. There's the demand for the spectrum, the traffic growth, and the mid-band requirement. Then the second key issue is the coexistence, and then I think the third key issue is potentially the competing demand and the nations outside of Europe that have already made a decision to make this band unlicensed for Wi-Fi. So if I can maybe ask each of you just to say something, you know, in response to what you heard from the industry on each of those 3 points: the demand, the coexistence, and the competing uses. So maybe we'll start with you, Eric.
Okay, yeah, and concerning the traffic, that was quite interesting, including the figures which are on the increase of traffic during COVID time, even more in mobile than in fixed. That was an interesting figure. So basically, we are convinced by the traffic increase, but of course there are some other elements, and traffic can also be accommodated by densification of networks. So it's not just one single argument. Concerning the coexistence, that's what I mentioned before. The FSS uplink, I could see the simulation from industry. Basically, what is probably missing is that the studies was really focusing on something which is limited coverage. I mean, it was part of Africa and part of South of Europe, and that maybe for wider coverage, including with coverage to the north of Europe, where you will have some low elevation angle, that you may have some more difficulties. So that's something we would like to study, even if we are quite open, as I mentioned before. And then for competing demand, we are aware of that, and that's something which will be considered after WRC 23. But we are really looking seriously to IMT demand here. Just one argument. I'm not sure it's really an argument to say you should have equal spectrum access between Wi-Fi and IMT. I mean, why? So it's not an argument in itself, but we are fully understanding that IMT is something which is important, and Wi-Fi too, by the way. Thank you.
Okay, Sergey, if I can maybe come to you now. I mean, I think you stated a very clear situation in Russia in relation to the difficulties in 3.4 to 3.8, and so your interest in this band. But could you say a little bit more about what you heard from the industry there, perhaps about the compatibility issues, and also, as Eric just mentioned there, the potential competing demand and Wi-Fi?
Yes, thank you very much, Janet. Yeah, first of all, regarding the need of spectrum, of course, we have this unique situation with difficulty in the 3438, and from the regulator side, we considering also 48, 499 as one of the key band for Russia to deploy 5G. But the issue of the demand that this almost 200 megahertz is not enough because we have 4 operators, and to have a 5G network with full possibilities, we need at least 100 megahertz per operator. So from this point of view, definitely we need some more spectrum. And the figures which was shown to us at the presentation, we also see and convince with them that the demand is growing and the traffic is growing. And it means that if we put aside our unique situation and ask me whether we will be in favor of looking at 6 gigahertz for 5G and maybe even for 6G or 5G plus, whatever, we definitely will be in favor of this. So the second issue regarding compatibility and sharing, we do a lot already in Russia with this. And we have, if we look at the whole frequency band, 6.425, 7.125, I can say that we see the problem for the lower part and upper part of this band, 100 frequency both, because of the unwanted emission and the usage of the upper part above 7100 with some space operation services. As for the compatibility with the fixed satellite service, I can say that we consider this, what Eric mentioned, when you have elevation angle of Earth station less or around 10.5 degrees. And indeed, the interference is increasing, but we still have some margin to be for this case, and there is not expected interference if we take this I over n minus 10 as what is agreed in working party 5D. And finally, the competing demand. This is one of the important issue, because Wi-Fi versus IMT was a huge debate in our administration and in regulator what to do with this. And I guess that we come to the, I would say, some balanced approach that lower part, almost 600 megahertz, should be used by Wi-Fi, and the upper part should be licensed. And there is a number of reasons. I will not stop on all of them. Why is license is better than iLicense? But with such approach, we believe the demand of both technology and the services they are providing will be met, at least in our market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. So, Alexander, your reactions then. I think you mentioned some question marks also about the sharing studies. Do you want to elaborate on that, and the radio astronomy as well? I mean, we haven't heard of any industry studies on that today. Is that something that has to be addressed?
Okay, yeah, let's start with your 3 questions before regarding the traffic densification and also growing traffic over the years. I think this is unquestionable. And we could totally believe in those figures there. However, then building up only on spectrum in a particular range, that is maybe the critical point here. We've seen that the study started at 1.4 gigahertz, so we're leaving the sub-gigahertz frequencies totally out of scope, and we are leaving away also the millimeter wave things. If you go through network densification, like Eric pointed out before, with regards to spectrum demands, it makes it more and more difficult to really make realistic traffic demands, assumptions and calculations regarding the spectrum from traffic into spectrum into a different band, because due to densification you will reach certainly very easily a certain level where it makes more sense to use equipment of a higher band. And if millimeter wave is coming up then in the later years, then maybe we see the figures that in urban areas we see more millimetric wave networks out deployed there, which then can handle easily the traffic due to their huge bandwidths available there, instead of bringing that into the mid bands. That could be one figure, and therefore we need to be very careful when we are really calculating those elements. I heard already that the ITU went a little bit away from that one, calculating really the spectrum demand on a different band due to the different estimations, and we need to be careful here as well. Regarding the coexistence, from our perspective, yes, we need to have a clear debate regarding the radio astronomy protection. From our side, our radio astronomists have already brought in some kind of coexistence studies, and we are currently nationally discussing them and bring them also to the ITU into the studies discussions there as well. And we would like to invite everybody to really join into this concert and discuss them seriously on the ITU level. Regarding the other part of the FSS uplink, I just had recently an example and a very intense discussion on the protection of an FSS Earth station in 3.4, 3.8 gigahertz, where we definitely need to discuss maybe a replacement of it in order to allow 5G. When we now hear that 6 gigahertz networks will be in the same environment, we will definitely come to the conclusion that it is the similar situation regarding the coexistence, and therefore any blockage of those FSS Earth stations or the uplink there may be critical for us and many others as well. So we need to be very careful in the analyzation of those elements, and we would like to see definitely more studies, maybe also from the industry, how this protection can be assured, because our protection zones now blocking maybe the deployment of 5G networks, and that may be the issue in later cases as well. And the regulator cannot accept that we can just maybe then push out a certain service already of this band, in particular not at 6 gigahertz on the FSS. That's a global service, and the uplink bands are the essential backhaul of that service, and therefore we don't believe that this is the right way forward. Regarding the competing demand of Wi-Fi, well, yeah, that's competition. If we have, as we have seen already, the 500 or 600 megahertz made available for Wi-Fi, that's for the indoor usage. We are now speaking about outdoor usage, so therefore it's already a difference. And on the other side, we have seen there also ongoing studies in that regard before, and we are seeing also some further studies with regards to the higher band as well on a similar assumption. So therefore we are open and would like to see then all elements on the table before we can take a clear decision on that one. And if, as said, if you can combine as much as possible into a certain band, then we should do that in order to make available the most efficient use of the spectrum. I think that's the critical point which each regulator has to take into account. Thank you.
Thank you. And Umberto, just over to you then on those sort of three questions, the demand and the compatibility and the competing uses.
Thank you. And it's an easy task for me to be the last one because I'm not going to repeat all the things that my colleagues said. I more or less agree with all of them. Just some small observation more regarding the demand from industry. Yes, very impressive, the figures. I already saw here in Italy something similar, and an aspect that impressed me was the fact that the higher increase was in the in the hour of the evening, an Italian operator, showed us with a deeper insights that this was mostly due to people looking at Netflix or Amazon Video. What I mean is that in this sense, the use of the network being from 5G or from Erlang is also, at least on this aspect, quite expensive. You know, it's the matter of single cast versus multicast, and this is an open debate with the broadcast operator community. Regarding the coexistence, we as regulators, we will look with many attention to all the studies that will come out. Of course, they have to be complete, and I have to I want to suggest the fact that sometimes studies cannot be considered complete if they do not look at something I would call a total cost of ownership. I mean that sometimes if I find a technical solution that is feasible, this does not necessarily mean that will be affordable for all the community of operators, of licensed operators or not licensed, that will be affected by a change in the regulation. Just to name a case, I cited the fact that a part of our fixed links in the currently in the 6 GHz bands are the fixed link for the distribution network of the broadcast operators. Now, a certain number, a huge number of these links were in the previously in the 3.6 to 3.8 GHz band, and they have to be accommodated in this band when that one was given to the 5G. So these are all aspects that cannot be that have to be taken into account, seriously into account by a regulator. Regarding the competing demand, there is no doubt that is competing demand. I listened with interest to the intervention of Tim Frost. Again, this is something I already received from another contribution here during the Italian meetings. This idea of balanced approach seems interesting, and we will it could be an interesting point of view to work around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would just say that I think a few of you have raised some questions sort of back to the industry, Alexandra, for example. So we will make sure that we bring these questions back up when we have the industry panelists available again. So it sort of sounds like at a very high level then, in terms of sort of the key issues that have to be addressed in terms of the agenda item 1.2, there doesn't seem to be too much disagreement on the sort of traffic forecasts and the demand. However, Alexander, you have raised an important point about that demand being met in total mobile spectrum, including millimeter wave and other bands, and not specifically on this band. So it seems as if the sort of question marks are more around the compatibility issues, the coexistence issues, first of all, and then also I think we also have a question in Europe that I will come back to on the competing demand and Wi-Fi. But if I can just maybe focus in on the coexistence again, because there was a question actually from the regulatory authority in Lithuania. Could we provide more information on possible compatibility with FSS? And then the comment was that there was a recent presentation from the European Space Agency strongly opposing an allocation of IMT in this band. And I think this probably sort of highlights that this is a very divisive topic. Does anybody want to, just mention that, sort of how we see the compatibility issues progressing from here? Eric, you've already given a sort of indication here that we perhaps need to look at the coverage footprint and sort of, look at more of a sort of worst case rather than what's been presented so far. We can't hear you, Eric.
Sorry, I'm trying not to put some background noise. So yeah, to respond directly to the Lithuanian question, that's the point for MESA is about the production of some passive observations over the ocean, and it's something which has a very limited status in the radio regulation. It's even not an allocation, even not secondary. But the use is real. They have some instrument over ocean, and it's not yet totally clear to which point, if you have some deployment on the landmass area, to which point it would create difficulties say on the coast side of the ocean. So it's something we certainly have to look at. I mean, on the practical point of view, knowing that the status is quite limited in the radio regulation. Also on the coexistence, Alexander made a very important point that 3438 was not so good example in the way once 5G is here, you have to migrate the Earth stations. That may be easier for transmitting Earth stations, so in terms of balance of links. But in the 6 GHz, you have also some downlink Earth stations. That's where, for example, a satellite operator like Globalstar have all its feeder links. So if you kill this frequency band, there's one Earth stations in France, then the system cannot operate at all. So there will be certainly also need to protect some downlink FSS or stations in this frequency band. And please, to operators, avoid this kind of tactic or politics where you say you can share, and then you say all others should move out of the frequency band. It's a very dangerous game, and that's creating some trauma in the other spectrum community. Then for FSS, we will study that. We will contribute it from French point of view, and I think we have the same idea as Sergey with the low elevation, with Russian Federation, sorry, with the low elevation angle, and that's something which will be in the next 5D meeting, I think.
Thank you. Yes, Eric, you raised a point that was on my list of questions as well. So the current allocations do include these non-GSO satellite feeder links. So it's the likes of Globalstar, Omnispace, etc. Can you? So there's one of these Earth stations in France, I think you said. Do we know sort of the totality of those in Europe? How many are we talking about?
It's limited. I cannot give you a number. It's limited, but there are also some other project. Even in the Galileo side, there were also some project to have possible further downlink here. But in my understanding, it's something which will be limited to very low number of Earth stations, which can be placed in rural area. But they will be there. And they have to be able to continue to deploy it, and if there's some kind of politics saying, okay, we can accept some existing Earth station, but not some new one, there's a difficulty here. We need to be more flexible in terms of sharing frequency band. It's totally clear.
Understood. So I think we will come back to some of these questions when we have the industry panelists as well. I wanted just to move on then to another question, which is about the competing demand and the fact that the entire 6 gigahertz band will be supported by Wi-Fi 6 devices, and that has already been enabled in other markets. There was an interesting decision, I think, taken at the recent ECC meeting in Berlin in November. So there's a new work item, as I understand, which is on our LAN in 6425 to 7125 megahertz. The time frame of that study, I think, is longer than the WRC preparation phase. Can you just say something about that work item on our LAN? How does it relate, if in any way, to the WRC topic, and how will Europe resolve that work item? Alexander, I don't know if you want to start on that one.
Yes, I can start with that one. Well, the ECC took an interesting approach regarding that particular request on the new work item. From our understanding and my personal understanding of that one, there should be no interrelation between the work item at the WRC and the work item at the CPT issue. Of course, we need to take into account the usage, the existing usage below 6425. That's clear at the WRC side. However, this new work item should provide already maybe technical background studies and compatibility information regarding a possible R-line usage in the upper part as well. And therefore, the time frame is exactly rightly picked in order to see when the studies on the WRC issue are ready, then they could be taken into account and we can take then the right decision after the WRC, which is the best way forward for Europe. And maybe have to do later on further work in a particular regulation size. So therefore, it's or from my understanding, it is now separated from the path of the preparation of the WRC. But of course, both elements and the results of that one have to be considered together at the end. But that's after WRC when we come to the maybe harmonization decisions in Europe for which the band should be used.
Thank you, Alexander. Does any of the other panelists, do you want to comment on this question about the RLAN work item? If not, then I will maybe just ask one other question, which is, you know, I think you've all said that the traffic forecasts are well set out. However, it does sound as if the compatibility issues are complex and there are further studies needed. If it is concluded that the upper 6 gigahertz is then not supported by Europe for IMT identification, what other options do you think there could be? And Alexander, I take your point that there are existing bands above 24 gigahertz in the millimeter wave, but just given that the industry's presentations were very much focused on the mid bands, I wondered, are there other options? And this is not just for 5G, but potentially thinking in the time frames of the rest of this decade, you know, potentially thinking beyond that into 6G.
Again, for me, that's nice. You mentioned my name. Yeah, Janet. Regarding 6G, I think we need to take into account then how the technical implementation or the technical specifications of 6G are looking like, and then we can maybe also digest if there are any further sharing opportunities in the range. I would say 1 to 10 gigahertz. Of course, this may come up then also with the proposal made by Eric before. Then maybe we have to reconsider some of the discussions on 6 gigahertz as well. So therefore, it would be wise if we have as many information as possible already for WRC 23 before we can take a decision. Thank you.
And Sergey, if I can maybe ask you, I think you have set out more of an immediate need for mid-band and asking 3GPP to standardize. That does suggest a short-term plan. Could you say something then about if this doesn't move forward in Europe, what your thoughts are?
Yes, thank you, Janet. Actually, this request to 3GPP from the RCC side to include into the specification is very much linked to our discussion on the sharing and compatibility issue. And in this respect, what was the most worries of incumbent users that interference to the receiver could be. At the same time, we make this lot of studies internally so far, and we're supposed to submit them in ITUR, in Working Party 5D, for consideration. We note that existing, I would say, condition which is described in Article 21 of the radio regulation. In this band with space receivers and terrestrial services, including IMT. And the issue is whether these conditions will be good enough for the IMT deployment and IMT implementation. And this is one of the elements that we in our administration decided to study a little bit more to see how this condition will be suited for the 6 gigahertz IMT service. So when supposed to be submitted to the 3GPP next week actually is based on these conditions. So this is something that we supposed to see in the specification for IMT. And yes, the demand, if we compare with the millimeters wave, this 6 gigahertz band, we see that millimeters wave is more oriented currently, at least we see from the market, to the verticals rather than to the operators. And our operators are not very, I would say,
Apologies, I think we've lost Sergey there. So we will come back to what he was saying there. I think in the main session. Oh, Sergey, you're back. Sergey, we cannot hear you, so I think we will move on and we will come back to what you were saying in the main discussion. So one final question, and then we're going to invite the industry panelists. So the other use of 6 gigahertz is fixed links. Umberto, you mentioned the fact that fixed links in Italy are not just used by the MNOs, but also importantly, it forms part of the distribution network of the broadcaster. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Of something we might talk about in the full panel session as well, is that there is also an agenda item 1.5 for the WRC23, which is looking at future use of the 470 to 960 spectrum and sort of broadcasting more generally. Sort of what's your issue? What's your view then on the distribution network for the broadcaster, the sort of longevity of that requirement?
Yes, okay, thank you. Yes, the issue, the agenda item 1.5 is very sensitive. By the way, it's a pity that we are missing Sergey. I hope he will be able to come back because he's the chairman of the task group in the ITU that is following this agenda item. Not without problems, but this is another a totally different story. And regarding the situation of the broadcast in Italy, we have clearly stated in the questionnaires from the CAPT that we envision to have a broadcast network with a certain band in the below the 700 megahertz up to 2030, and of course this piece of the whole framework, I mean this distribution network is another important piece. Broadcast operators highlighted the fact that it's not fair and it's not complete to consider only the problem of the sub 700 megahertz band if I do not take into account their need to have band for their distribution network. In Italy, in particular, today this distribution network is make a particular use of the 6 gigahertz band. So this is an issue for us. That's all.
Thank you very much, Umberto. So I would like to welcome everybody back. hope you've all been enjoying this discussion we've been having with the regulatory speakers. You will have heard, everybody, that we did have a few questions, so we're now going to open up, I think, for the full panel. Let's start, if we may, then, with the question that Alexander raised. I think you will have heard sort of not too much dissent on the traffic demand estimates, but some questions about the total mobile spectrum portfolio, the role of millimeter wave, both for 5G, new radio, and also potentially for RLAN, actually, in the 57 to 71. So, I mean, does somebody want to maybe start by just talking about the role of millimeter wave? Peter, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Jeanette. Thanks, everyone. Very interesting points there. Yeah. So millimeter wave is a very important component of our spectrum portfolio and our multi-layer spectrum strategy. It can be used to provide short range, very high capacity, low latency, short range communications in stadiums, venues, capacity hotspots, etc., MPN, factories, etc., using 5G technology. So very, very important for us. But what it does not do is, and I think everyone on this call and beyond understands the laws of physics. It can't propagate into buildings. It can't propagate round buildings. It can't propagate over buildings. So if we wanted, so in the context of citywide coverage and capacity, if we wanted to use millimeter wave, we would need to have an extreme densification of our network, both indoors and outdoor areas, which is frankly economically and practically unfeasible. Which is why mid-bands are so important, because mid-bands provide that blend of capacity and coverage, which allows us to use our existing mobile network infrastructure to evolve our 5G networks in an economic way. Okay, so millimeter wave does not mitigate or substitute the need for mid-band spectrum. And indeed, that is exactly why 6 gigahertz is so critical to the mobile industry and mobile services.
Thanks, Peter. I'd like to introduce Lewis from the GSMA. Lewis, I wonder, do you want to say something as well on the relation of millimeter wave and densification and the spectrum needs that you've presented?
Oh, of course. Thank you so much, Jeanette. And I'm representing Luciana Camargo. She was not able to continue. Lucy Lipizogby's Senior Spectrum Manager here at the GSMA. So in complementing what Peter just pointed out, and I think that's something that we considered during our work with Coleago and our mid-band needs. So within those 2 gigahertz that we talked as on average, we considered millimeter waves as part of the offload, as well as Wi-Fi and indoor small cells. And then we also made sure that the densification was considered throughout the work. So all bands that are already assigned, they have been considered as with additional densification in order for them to work in 5G. So our densification during it was 400 meters. So it's already conservative throughout the whole process of the work that we did. And with that densification, we already consider that as challenging, because there are lots of places where that's not possible to densify more, and that would be a risk of interference. We see places with densification of 150 meters already. So the additional spectrum is needed, considering the densification we had in mind. And also, whenever densification is possible, the costs could be up to 5 times more if 1 gigahertz or less 1 gigahertz was available instead of those 2 gigahertz. So their risk puts 5G under risk, and also makes it impossible to densify even more. So those are the comments that I'd like to make into looking into millimeter wave. That's also considered in the work as part of the offload, and the impossibility sometimes to actually densify. But as much as it's possible to densify, we have considered, and whenever it's possible to densify even more, it can cost up to 5 times more to balance 1 gigahertz. So I think that wouldn't be productive for the operators and also for the environment as well, if you have that in mind.
Thank you, Lewis. Erica, do you want to say something?
Yes, maybe I will add from a different perspective, because we are talking about the millimeter wave and the usage for mobile. And exactly as or I should say the operators are using millimeter wave, as Peter said, is for smaller ranges, but also for areas where there is a very high capacity needed. Then when we look at radio LAN and specifically at Wi-Fi, there are some use cases that are indeed require very high capacity. So considering in Europe, we had this discussion some time ago, and also after WRC23 on the allocation of the 66 to 71 gigahertz for short-range devices, and 57 to 66 gigahertz was already allocated for short-range devices. That gives the unlicensed usage and spectrum between 57 and 71 gigahertz. So we would expect also the Wi-Fi community and industry to use these very high ranges to put use cases that indeed require very high capacity, just as we are doing in the mobile world. Because of course, at the end, it's very important that everyone does their part on the efficient use of spectrum.
Thank you, Erica. While you're speaking, I wondered if you could say more about something else which came up with the regulatory discussion, just the timescales for this additional mid-band need. If we're talking about sort of end of this decade, we're getting into the sort of potential early stages of 6G. I wondered if could you say a little bit more about the technology evolution and the 6G topic?
Yes, I can do that. So if we look at the spectrum needs that were presented by GSMA, of course, they are assuming only 5G use cases. So if we just consider the 5G use cases that we have today, and we expect that will evolve, then that's when we see that we need additional spectrum. The additional spectrum, we see that the need will be between 2025 and 2030. Now, by 2030, that is really when the technology will basically be defined for 6G. So we expect by 2030 maybe to have some initial tests, some initial trials on 6G, but we don't really expect to have commercially available 6G. We are indeed now working on 6G, so there is a lot of discussions in Working Party 5D. All different mobile vendors and operators, all the companies are working on 6G and defining the use cases. But at the moment, the spectrum needs have not been calculated yet. So the request for the mid-bands is really to consider, rather than 6G, is for the evolution of 5G.
Okay, thank you, Erica. I think there's a question from the audience. The question is, in those regions where access to upper 6 gigahertz is not available, how are the MNOs going to address this? And the question is, why don't MNOs use 5G new radio unlicensed and have access, therefore, to the entire 6 gigahertz band? Why does 5G have to be licensed? And that was from an anonymous member of the audience. So any of the operators want to answer that one? So in some regions where, some regions where 6 gigahertz is not going to be available, how will you address that? Stefan, do you want to start off the discussion?
Yeah, thank you. Talking as an operator that we're using also unlicensed spectrum for our for Wi-Fi offload. We're in the business of providing connectivity that is associated with the quality of service, and we guarantee service in some respect to our clients, and some of the use cases and applications that we're providing or we will provide need some security in terms of connectivity, which cannot be met using unlicensed spectrum. Imagine having remote medicine, remote consultation, or remote medical operations using unlicensed spectrum. It is impossible to do that.
Thank you, Stefan. Do any of the operators want to comment? Peter?
Yeah, I just completely agree with that. I mean, we're talking here about providing reliable wide area services and unlicensed technology, even though it's 5G. U is not suitable. It has a place, but it's not suitable in terms of providing reliable wide area secure communications. There's no comparison there.
Okay, and I mean the other part of the question from the audience, I mean maybe this talks to Tim's presentation, and unfortunately Tim's not here, but in some regions where upper 6 gigahertz is not going to be available for mobile, is that a concern to the MNOs? So if the outcome of agenda item 1.2 is that 6425 to 7125 is identified for licensed IMT in Europe, but other regions don't all follow that, is that a concern, or do you think the ecosystem in Europe is sufficient for your needs? And I think there's another question maybe about can the device cope with the two different solutions, so IMT and Wi-Fi? Okay, Jan, over to you.
Yeah, I think I mean, most of us are more European operators, but from the ecosystem point of view, I think if Europe decides for an IMT identification for the 6 gigahertz band, this market is quite big enough in terms of developing the ecosystem for this band. So this would not be the concern. And also, as we have seen, also China is talking about licensed use. So I think in the end, the decision for an IMT allocation for the 6 gigahertz band, the WRC, would lead to an evolving ecosystem and to a quite rapid deployment of this band in Europe.
Thank you. Erica, do you want to comment?
Yes, maybe from a vendor perspective, just to remind that the WRC 23 agenda item is not only for Europe, so it's for region 1, which means that includes also Middle East, and it includes, of course, African countries. But say that also we need to remember that Europe is quite powerful, so usually decisions that are being taken in Europe are not contained to be used in Europe. We can remember all other bands that we have allocated and we have harmonized in Europe, and there are other countries that harmonize with Europe as well. So we do expect that if there is WRC 23 IMT identification, also considering some countries have decided that they will use the band for license uses, there will be other countries also outside region 1, and that will definitely create the ecosystem.
Thank you, Erica. Eric, did you have a comment on that?
Well, I think the question was not completely responded. I understand that Asia or some countries in Asia may move also for the 6 gigahertz, but I think Paris was the higher spectrum demand in Europe. But I guess you would have done the same in New York. You would have obtained at least the same. So what is the maybe to Erica? What is the amount of spectrum which is requested to the US regulator? Obviously, the upper 6 gigahertz will not be available. So, what is the message to FCC when you are meeting FCC on how to get some additional spectrum? And sorry for these tricky questions, which was in fact from the audience originally. Thank you.
Okay, I guess that question goes back to me. I don't know if Luis wants to mention, because I know that if I remember right, Manhattan was included in the report.
Yes, it is.
I don't know if you want to comment on that, and then I can comment.
No,
as well
of course, yeah. Manhattan is included in the work, and it does have a really high needs, such as in Paris. That's correct, Eric. What happens, and I think that answers the first question, is what happens whenever decisions around 6 gigahertz have already been taken, such as in the United States, for example, in other places. I think that was the big question that was there. So we have to look into what is still available, such as for 525, the upper part of the 3.5 gigahertz, or the upper part of C-band, and make sure that every other opportunity is taken into consideration to have the amount of spectrum available. Of course, there is a risk around not having 6 gigahertz, but as for example, United States, that cannot go back, but they are trying their best to make sure that other bands are available. But that still is a risk to the deployment of 5G within this decade. So that's I think that's good to remind about the work and the risks around it. But there are other parts of the band that should be considered as well.
Erica?
Yeah, maybe if I can comment also a little bit, if we also think about, yes, the FCC, of course, they decided on the allocation of the whole 6 gigahertz for Radio LAN, but we also need to keep in mind that there were actually requests from the mobile industry to allocate at least the upper part for license. So there were filings from different, of course, from the MNOs, and the FCC is doing additional efforts now to look at what other options they could have in the mid-bands, so that they can also address the needs from the mobile operators. So as we see, 6 gigahertz is really a key opportunity now, because there are not so many bands that are, or there are not bands that are very large, in the mid-band range. So, and if you look at the US, for example, they have also considered spectrum above 3.7 gigahertz. That is spectrum that we don't have, for example, in Europe at the moment. So it's a matter of all the mid-bands and the mid-band needs, and what kind of a spectrum can be allocated.
Interesting. Thank you, Erica. Alexander, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, two points. Well, according to my knowledge of the FCC regulation, the mid-band spectrum in the US is starting at 355 gigahertz, and that is a little bit less than we have already available in Europe, and that is already the point why maybe we have to have an in-depth look on worldwide harmonization and global harmonization. What we're discussing here is now we are preparing something for the World Radio Conference only for Region 1, and they then maybe splitting up Region 1 further into an African part, a European part, an Arabic part, or maybe only between countries which are willing to implement some of the IMT solutions. And then looking into the whole agenda item 1.2, I think there is a lot of splitting in it. So we definitely, and that's maybe one question also to the industry here when we look to the regulation and of course a task for the regulators, how do we would like to proceed with that kind of movement if we would like to look for specific footnotes only for limited countries, and that then increasing the pressure on other countries which have no possibility to join into this concert, or only if they clean up the bands on total costs and then socializing those costs to their communities. That's maybe not good for the society at all. Maybe good for some cost benefit ratios, but not overall for the spectrum use. Therefore, we need to be careful when we just requiring that this is really a harmonized solution. Europe's market is strong. Of course, the US market is strong as well, and some markets in Asia as well. But we need to be careful when we would like to extend that to on a global scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Sergey, I wondered if I could bring you in on this point. Just sort of, thinking about what other regions might do. Erica's point about the FCC looking at other options which might be above 7 gigahertz. What's your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, actually, looking at the FCC decision, Alexander pointed out that they start from the 3,550, so it's 100 megahertz less than in Europe. At the same time, they ended in 3,850, as I understand, and this is quite far from what we have in the radio regulation. So, and what US will see, I don't know actually, but looking at that region 2, we see that the demand, at least in 10 gigahertz, is clearly indicated, and agenda item 1.2 for region 2 includes this part, 10 gigahertz, as well as the part also below 3.4. So I guess US and the region 2 have some possibilities, but looking at the overall agenda 1.2, I see there is some balance between the demand of spectrum. The issue is that we are looking for spectrum in different area, and this is definitely because of some divergence usage of spectrum in these two regions. As for the 6 gigahertz band, particular, I guess, will be interest also of countries like Russia and the countries which are around the equator, where the C-band 3438 is very heavily used for the fixed satellite service. And to get compatibility on the Earth when the Earth station are close to the base station is much more difficult than to get compatibility when you have a IMT station on Earth and space station 33,000 kilometers away from this part. So this is why there is interest for the 6 gigahertz band. And I believe that the number of countries, if we follow this decision to have a national footnote, will be huge, particular from region 1, because almost all African countries has this situation that lower part of C-band is difficult to use for them, and they definitely may migrate and benefited from the use of 6 gigahertz band. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think in the African countries, though, that there may be another challenge that the 6 gigahertz is used for fixed links, especially where there's no fiber. So I think there is another challenge there. There's several questions. We only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to very quickly go through. Question for Peter from Takpun at Ofcom. You've said that millimeter wave is intended for short range. Does that mean that Vodafone will not consider millimeter wave for macro?
Short answer is no. We consider it where it's useful and it's appropriate to use. From a macro, certainly not in every macro, which is the reason why we're all on here this call today, and that's why we need mid-band spectrum, again, which provides a coverage and capacity. There are some macros where you can illuminate data hotspot areas, main squares, tourist locations. There's an opportunity there, but it's fairly limited.
Thank you very much, Peter. So there's another question. Erica, I wonder if you might be able to answer this. The question is, will AIR and AAU be able to support 3.5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz at the same time, or will we need a separate unit for 6 gigahertz?
Was that question for me?
Well, I think it's to
so.
do. I think it's to do with antennas, isn't it? So
yes, yes, correct.
I'm wondering if you might be able to address it.
Yes, so considering I'm representing, of course, to all IMT vendors, I must say that is really dependent on implementation. So you could put them together or not. That really depends on the implementation, and there are different things that you need to consider, cost among others.
Thank you very much, Erica. A question, actually, Alexander, from one of your colleagues. In accordance to the criticality of the mid-band spectrum, why is the mobile community not considering refarming all of FS connectivity to the suitable bands higher in the spectrum? So I think the question is, well, Stefan, you mentioned this yourself, that the MNOs obviously have a key demand for fixed links. So you mentioned as well migrating to higher bands, but is there a scenario in which you migrate all of your fixed links to those higher bands?
Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation, this is a natural transition that happens to our fixed services. In the urban environment, we have fiber, and also we prefer shorter hops, fixed links. And also in the rural environment, we're also going for wider capacities. So short answer is yes, we are doing that, and it's this is a trend for us and for all of other mobile operators, I guess, at least in Europe.
Thank you. Jan, do you want to comment on that one as well?
Yeah, I just want to support that statement from Stefan as for the fixed links. I mean, we are concerning that this is work together, and that we are more and more putting all the footprint that we have in the mobile industry to fiber, also connected to the demands that we are seeing. More and more we will need fiber connections at the mobile stations to offload the traffic and backhaul the traffic. So I think it's kind of an evolvement that 6 gigahertz will not be heavily occupied by fixed links in the future, and that operators would easily be open to migrate to other bands if we get the band for IMT.
Thank you, Jan. So there's another question. Is there potential demand for licensed local services in the 6 gigahertz band? And the suggestion was that in the UK, there's been some suggestion that upper 6 gigahertz or indeed other mid-band spectrum might be used for sort of shared access or local 5G networks. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think we have, from European point of view, we have the 3842, which is now under study for local service in the mid band. So I'm not expecting any additional demand to that. So for me, it's a separate subject, and of course that's a personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
Yeah, maybe an addition to Eric. I think from the industry perspective, we also see that it's already 400 megahertz allocated to, or being studied, I should say, for licensed local services in 3842. And also considering that when we are talking about local usage, that is going to be reused. So it's not like in macro deployments, but it's you can reuse your licenses in a geographical way. So we don't expect more than 400 megahertz to be needed for local area usage.
Thank you. Umberto, did you want to make a comment?
Just a small addition about the Italian situation. Currently, our authority is carrying on a public consultation about local services, but in the 26 gigahertz band. So this here seems to be a request here, at least here in Italy. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else want to say anything either on that topic or any quick final remarks? Because if not, we're just running out of time. So I would just like to say thank you to all of the panelists. The event hosts asked me to mention that for those of you interested in this topic, there is another GSMA event taking place on January the 19th, 2022, and it's called 5G plus Wi-Fi 6, Maximizing Benefits of the 6 gigahertz band. So the topic will continue to be discussed at that event. So I would just like to say thank you, everybody. Dan, are you coming back to close the event?
Hi there. I wasn't planning on coming up, but happy to, Jeanette. So yeah, no, thank you to you, and thank you to all of our speakers. Apologies, I've had to remove Sergei from the screen because we were at our maximum number of people on screen. So apologies, Sergei, but thank you to you and to all of our speakers on behalf of the events partners. And yeah, really interesting discussion, and I'm sure there's one that is going to continue. So thank you to everyone, and yeah. Wishing everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.